lives, and actually, in fact, we are actually governed by numbers. It's not just in education, but our lives nowadays are governed by numbers. So what I want to do here is to have a space for discussion, to start thinking our pedagogic practices, but also our citizenship practices around how we interact, how we deal, and how we contest data in our pedagogy and in our lives. So Michel Foucault said that our society is not one of a spectacle, but of surveillance. The notion of surveilling capitalism, as kind of explained by Zuboff, it's quite interesting. We moved from what was known in the 90s and the early 2000s of the information society, where information was power, towards something called the DATAFIED society, where data, numbers, regulate our activities, prompt discussions in policy, and actually, in a way of another, manipulates political opinion. So if we think for a second how our lives are affected by data in our personal and professional lives, we can start spotting that we are tracked all the time, that our interactions with society are monitored and datafied, that our interactions with students are subject to metrics, and the same as our research. So when we think about how are we going to start challenging, how we start dealing, how we start reflecting about how data is impacting our life, we need to start thinking about concepts of datafied society. Schaeffer and Van Es from, I think they're Utrecht, explained that the datafied society as a society where everything is transcribed into data. What we eat, where do we go, our political opinions, our professional activities. Basically, since we get on a bus, everything in our daily lives is datafied. It can be transcribed into data. We need to think of data of something that is not neutral. Data is always a political instrument, and it's used, increasingly used, for making decisions. These decisions can be, of course, discussed at political level, or can be automated. And this is when we talk about algorithms and machine learning. In the context of education, Giroux argues that education should develop and improve people's abilities to recognize and challenge power dynamics. That comes from the school of Paulo Freire when we think about critical pedagogies. Therefore, Schaeffer and Van Es argue that students should become critical practitioners of data. When we think about the society infrastructure, okay, so we think about how information is organized in society, we can see a widening gap between those data literate, so those that make decisions around data, and those that are objects of study, the people that have no participation, no involvement on how the data is used to basically being affected by these decisions. So their points of view, their lives, their lived experiences render them just mere data objects. And there is this dysfunction in society, or this power structure around data, and we think about what Johnson says about the dynamics of the power groups that make decisions around data, and those that basically are objects. They are data entry points. There's, of course, a big movement around scholars that discuss issues around algorithmic decision-making and the intersection of inequities and power in the socioeconomic structures of society. Algorithms, mostly due to their obscure nature, tend to be racist by default. But also, it's just not race, it's gender and socioeconomic background that gets affected. So when we see about the intersections of inequities, and how people is labeled. And I'm going to show you an example of how people is labeled in the data context. Is about the semantics of metadata. We need to think about how the biases of data, which means our personal biases when we're processing and actually create instruments to collect data, have an impact in the decision-making processes of automated decision systems. And that has an impact in employment, healthcare, housing, prison, and also education. So we need to look at intersectional nature of structures of oppression, gender, class, race, and ethnicity. And in the context of education, how this creates an unequal access to quality lifelong learning education, how we're leaving people behind, or how we are misrecognizing and misidentifying elements of culture within data. And this is, for example, quite interesting on the work of Kugutai and Taylor about indigenous data sovereignty. So we need to extrapolate this information and think about how we're going to start giving agency to people that are normally data objects. In the context of education, because this conversation is really wide when we talk about policy governance at state level and governance level, government level, we need to start thinking that education is governed by data. So our responsibility as practitioners of education, aka researchers, educators, and people that work in professional services, is questioning how biased, how complex, and how unfair this data can be. Because one of the things that is happening now, and we've seen in our daily practice, is that educational data under the label of learning analytics is data that is being used by algorithmics to develop policies, for example. Data-informed policies, not lived experiences. So that tend to put vulnerable groups at risk. And this is an interesting piece of work that Ben Williamson has been developing around data governance in education. So if you can read his works, I totally recommend, because Ben is just absolutely great. Of course, currently, the measurement of everything is central to the modern education experience. Success is framed towards or framed around performance, and performance is actually assessed through metrics that can become very complex. So when we think about the datafication of education, we need to think about the datafication of learning. One of the things that we've noticed in our work with Leo, with Christian, which are my research partners, and I'm going to share with you at the end of the presentation, the paper just came out today, so we're very proud of it, is that datafication of learning, the idea of that data can answer all the questions, is the response to all the problems, is actually a new diacatholicon in the context of it's a pretense that the data provided by the information provided by data can solve all the educational problems. Well, actually, we have problems that cannot be sorted out by data or resolved by data. For example, hunger. If students come in hungry, there is no data that can solve that problem. We need to enable access to food and proper nutrition, for example. So the idea of like that data can create data-driven interventions and personalized learning, therefore solve all the problems related to performance, is putting at risk of jeopardizing complex and critical student-centered pedagogies. How are we thinking our pedagogies? How are we thinking our socioeconomic context? How are we thinking the differences, and how are we thinking the impact that our pedagogies have in our students beyond how much performance we can measure through different metrics? So one of the things that is happening quite a lot in schools is that this extreme need of providing data constantly around learning activities is coercing digital participation, because everything is measured through clicks and interaction with platforms. But sometimes these platforms collect data in a rather unethical way. Just because data needs to be collected, because needs to inform the metrics, but we are not thinking about the pedagogical processes around how we are interacting with data. So there is a counter movement around thinking from a critical perspective about this extreme datafication of education that is about raising awareness and resistance to surveillance and datafication in all aspects of life. For example, and this is an interesting example, the case of welfare allocation in the Netherlands, where people actually ended up taking very hard measures, and people was punished because the algorithm said that actually they were stealing money from welfare, when actually it was an error in the algorithm. Algorithms need to be subject in the context of public spaces, public arenas, and public governance, to be subject to auditing. We cannot allow that algorithms make decisions for us in terms of education, let alone all the aspects of society or lives in society, because these data-driven forces are altering society. People is being punished by algorithms, and this is quite interesting. And it's a book that I totally recommend you to read. It's called Weapons of Mass Destruction by Cathy O'Neill, because it shows examples on how machine learning and algorithms affect people's lives in different aspects, from housing to schools, employment, even insurance. So when we think about the education is being transformed by data, we need to keep an eye on how we're going to resist the use and abuse of data in our educational practices, and also in our research practices, and also create a sense of agency within our wider community of educators, but also as a sense of agency within our students. The students need to be able to contest their data, not just as students, but also as citizens. So we need to look at practices in this context of datafication and how the collection of data in every stage of our lives and spaces really aim at measuring and improving performance, and how we can question practices that are rather unethical or unfair, because not everything that is unethical, it's easy to spot, but at the human eye, unfairness is much easier for us to spot. The transformation of complex educational processes, for example, in order to benchmark, compare, and rank, and this is an example of like the university rankings, they are unfair. They are naturally unfair. So if we're gonna just try to climb up on the rankings without thinking how much we can affect vulnerable populations because they are not performing as well, so we need to leave them behind in order to raise up in our benchmarks. It's worrying because it's framing the working and lived experience of teachers and educators in general terms. We are always put to compete against benchmarks and targets and rankings. We rank people, we rank institutions, we rank educators. Everyone has a ranking. If you're an academic, think about your H index, for example. You are ranked against each other. We are ranked against other universities. Our students are ranked against other students. Everything is a ranking, and it's exhausting at some times. And datafication doesn't start in higher education. It starts from early childhood. Children are being rendered objects of data. The datafication of childhood, the work that Lupton and Williamson have been conducting, and also Neil Silwin, for example, about datafication of schools. Children are being given increasingly more and more platforms and devices to interact with. And this is an effect, for example, from the pandemic. Children have to use environments, electronic environments that datafy them, surveil them, even monitor their playing. So there is no space for creativity anymore. There's no space for critical thinking or for debate, because everything needs to be governed by metrics. We need to measure everything they do. Homework, reading through, for example, ebooks. Ebooks literally track, and their platforms are a bit scandalous, so they track eye movements, but they're platforms that track everything. And for example, in exams, when we think about these tools that basically monitor exams, that actually they have to scan your room, scan your eyes, scan your biometrical data, it's quite worrying the way that we are using these platforms from early childhood, where we're not giving space to nature or the natural development of a child. We're just subjecting them to the use of electronic devices. So databases, platforms, devices are reinventing the relationship between teachers and children or students, as everything needs to be compared, assessed, and acted upon. Children are basically reconfigured as miniature centers of calculation. And this is one interesting conversation that I had with Phil last year, when someone, and then Phil, I think, can explain the story a bit further. Someone said, like, I see children as my 3%, my 5%, my 7%. That's not a good label for a child, let alone an adult, but for a child. So we need to start thinking in how we think, how we perceive our students, and how we are also being datafied against their performance or against the activities that we do with them. This is part of the work that Nick Silwin and some of the colleagues, Carlo Perrotta, are doing in Australia. It's about the datafication of school and schooling, and we can extrapolate this information and extrapolate this idea very easily into higher education. It's the raising intentions of how to place a solution, how we see the future, how we are thinking about productivity in schools. Where is the data frictions and software procurement? We saw some issues about public procurement of software for educational settings during the pandemic, where all these big companies, these big corporations, offered freely to schools platforms and access to platforms, where actually what they were doing is like using their platforms to collect data about students without any policy provision about how to handle this data carefully. And we don't know what's going to happen with the data that was collected from children and students in higher education, because this data is hidden in their servers from Microsoft, servers from Google. So we need to think about how the data will have an impact in the next 20 to 25 years. When we think about data in schools, because it's a discussion that we can start thinking where our students already come quite datafied, is data seems to be a response for everything, but teachers don't know where the data comes from. Teachers don't know how the data is being collected. Teachers are not aware of how students are being rendered into numbers. But also, if we think about our academic practices, we're overloaded by data. And we cannot sometimes have the space to think about where the data comes from and what it's going to happen with the data, how we're processing the data, how this data is being used to make policy decisions, for example. We are not robots, and we don't have the capacity to do machine learning with our minds. So we cannot read the hundreds of tons of data that we get every single year. And we need to start thinking about how data frames our conversations about pedagogy. Because when we develop learning and teaching activities, we need to put the students at the center, but not their data all the time. But also from the perspective of a student, what do students say? Data's affecting their whole life since they're 3, 4, 5 years, early childhood. They have to interact with platforms. They have to interact with devices. They are basically monitored day and night, because we know when they interact, for example, with their online campuses. They don't have the right to data privacy when, for example, we use exam proctoring systems. How the edtech firms are collecting the data, how safe is the data in the hands of big corporations, where basically the currency is data. They are selling data to other entities. Data cannot personalize learning. We need to see how we can do it. Because if we don't think it thoroughly, we ended up leaving the students at the hands of data collection engines. And that also affects, or will have an effect in the future, mostly if they come from deprived or vulnerable backgrounds. This is an example. This is an example of a tool being used in China, which is the big lab of data, social data. And this is a tool that was implemented in the classrooms, in primary school classrooms in China, where they have facial recognition cameras that were designed to understand 6 types of behaviors: reading, writing, fundraising, standing up, listening to the teacher, but also recorded facial expression about being happy, being upset, being angry, fearful, disgusted. And that data was informed to teachers in order to control behaviors or enhance behaviors in the class. It's worrying. It's worrying that there are companies that are developing such technology, and there is no government policy, for example, against the use of invasive biometrical data collection tools in the classroom. And this is where I come back to the idea of weapons of mass destruction. Algorithms can favor and do favor discrimination and stigmatization. For example, and this is interesting in the field of health, women receive less quality treatment sometimes because a machine have decided that what they have, what their illnesses are not as severe as male. There is issues about how people get selected for trials. There is an issue about how people get selected for social housing, how people receive benefits, how people get access to jobs. Simple tools about, for example, selection of candidates for work, for potential jobs, leave behind women, where the machine sees male performance as assertive, sees women performance as conflicted. So algorithms are used to rank individuals against a set of metrics, but they are still a mystery. We don't know how to audit algorithms. And the cross-referencing of data, socioeconomic data, alongside, for example, student background information about the parents' immigration status, is used now to predict future performance. And this data, if it's not handled with care and where it's not used appropriately through platforms, and we don't have a governance infrastructure to protect our students, can be used in the future for banks. So, for example, that people that come from deprived backgrounds and got poor grades, when they apply for jobs, for example, if corporations have access to this information, they might be ranked below people that have higher grades in institutions, so they will be at the bottom of the pile when applying for a job because an algorithm decides so. But also, it will affect their insurance. If you live in certain postcodes, your car insurance will cost more than if you live in a safe postcode, because of course this is automated. Same car, same kind of family, same time, like length of having your driver's license. Premiums cost more depends on where you live. And in the case of like countries like the US, it has issues with health providers. So we need to think how data collected in educational settings can have and does have an impact in people's future lives, for example, employment. So the idea of surveilling learning are we really measuring the quality of learning through metrics, through clicks? Every activity on the student's life, it's been monitored nowadays. Every click counts. This is what we're doing, whether we like it or not. Click here, engagement. Is engagement really something that we can measure through clicks? Is learning something that we can measure through clicks, or we need to leave the space and the time for people to digest what they have learned in a year, and maybe they will have the time to apply 2 to 3 years later? Data provides what seems to be automatic responses to problems that basically need time to grow, to mature, because learning is not an automatic thing. It's a lifelong learning. It's a lifelong process. So we need to be careful and keep an eye on how we think about engagement through clicks, for example. But this is our personal reflection. I'm not telling you that it's right or wrong. We just need to think about that. Sometimes students have figured out how to pretend to be engaged in the click, but they're actually watching something else. But it looks like they clicked everything, so they looked at very engaged. But people that takes their time to read and it's slower interacting with the platform seems less engaged, but actually they are the ones doing all the studying, not just playing clicks here and there. So can algorithms predict learning and how can have an impact in elements of social inclusion or exclusion? Algorithms are broken and biased, are obscure, are secretive, are complex, and are completely opposed to the idea of participation and transparency in a political landscape. If we think all the discourse about political involvement and participation in society and all these ideas generated, for example, from open government, but then you're audited by an algorithm that is obscure and nobody can audit. Where's the transparency here? I'm not saying that every algorithm is evil, because they're not. They are ways to make, so mostly through participation and co-creation, to make algorithms that are roughly fair, and they can help us to sort out problems. For example, waiting lists in hospitals. This is something that it's being used, and it's actually reducing the times because it's easier for the machine to handle millions of pieces of data than for a human being to make these decisions. So it's helping in some contexts, and it's helping, for example, in imaging, in the health sector, because the machine understands which is male, which is female, which might be intersex, and can spot things that the human eye cannot. But and it helps to sort up some issues around imaging. And there are 3 examples that I might be able to share with you later. But we need to think about how student performance is measured through algorithms, and which algorithms are measuring your students, because we can end up stigmatizing or portraying vulnerable group of students in a very unfair manner. Here's another example. During the big US collapse in the 2000s, Florida passed a law that established that performance funding for universities. So funding for students was directly tied to the school scores in certain criteria. So schools, thinking about primary and secondary schools, mostly high school in the US. So worst performing schools missed funding data for students to attend university, and that was algorithmically decided. But there is a reason that why they're worst performing schools, and it has to do with lack of appropriate funding for schools that have students with more social needs, students that need support in food or getting access to resources, for example, families of single income or no income or very low income at all, for example. So basically they were punishing the poor. So this is kind of a constant in this narrative. Keep punishing the poor, just because you're poor. So therefore your socioeconomic data said you will have no performance. And I'll show you an example soon that it's not far away from our reality. I want you to look at this map. This is London, and this comes from a property site website that uses offset data, which is open access, so it's like open data, to show prices and value of the housing in central London. So if you see this little map that comes from this company, which I'm not going to name, shows a school, Monica Primary School, which is near Pimlico, south of London, very close to Knightsbridge, where the houses are extremely expensive. But look at the red square. It's called inadequate. This is semantics, politics of semantics in metadata. The school is inadequate, or the people in the school is inadequate. When you graduate from that school, will you keep the inadequate label tagged to your forehead for the rest of your life because you come from an inadequate school? So from that very point, this is a primary school, from that very point, you will be always subject to certain specific monitoring and tracking systems because you come from an inadequate school. The language is horrendous. I wouldn't call a school inadequate. I wouldn't call poorly funded. I would call it lacking of extra support. Inadequate. How children from 3 years old, like a 3-year-old child, already has a label, inadequate. So when this child applies for university, they will be immediately put on into the vulnerable category. So there's going to be surveilled and targeted and follow up. And then when they apply for a job, they're going to go on the bottom of the pile because they come from an inadequate school. And if they live around there, they're going to come from an inadequate neighborhood, inadequate household. I don't think it's a good term. And we need to think about the broader impact of this terminology when we portray people's lives, because this is people's lives, this is family lives into data. Semantics are extremely important when we describe data and when we describe people's lives around data. So the idea is not just showing you the horror stories, is to think about how we're going to develop a process of fairness in data analytics, in learning analytics. So we think about learning analytics about information that can help us improve our practices and provide better supports to our students, rather than just monitor them and say, okay, this group is at risk. We need to create spaces, arenas, and activities to support them without labeling them inadequate. So how we gather data from, exams and quizzes and readings and the use of multimedia, how they communicate, online discussion, social media. But of course, there is a huge element around it, which is their socioeconomic background. We know where they come from, and we expect them to move up in the society in terms of economy to prevent them to just maintain this status quo of their families. So when we think about learning analytics, we think about data that can provide information about the learners and finding ways to understand means to optimize their learning in environments in general terms, but also how we're going to create strategies to support them to become lifelong learners. But it is important that when we create learning analytics infrastructure, the users, so in that case, students and academics and teachers and educators and colleagues in general, can understand the models that the learning analytics produce and also the outcomes that they can deploy. Because the student should have the right to understand why they've been selected for a specific intervention And they might want to challenge the basis for the selection. Why you're targeting me? Why I have no say when you're targeting me? I don't understand why you're targeting me, because there hasn't been a dialogue. If we say, okay, we need to work with you, not around you, but with you, to ensure that you don't leave university, that you complete your degree, that you get the support that you need. It's different than like, I'm targeting and I'm doing an intervention, and you're not even aware of that, because that's unfair. So the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, why students from poor backgrounds should be targeted all the time, due to the predictions of their performance or because of the heritage. Why students from deprived neighborhood are to be surveilled because of the rankings of the schools, so inadequate schools. We need to think about why machines are always telling us how students learn, because we know how they learn, and actually it's our job to ensure that they learn. Because basically we're just in a cycle, on a loop of feeding the machine. So we need to question also our own practices. We need to think about learning and frequency of clicks. Can algorithms provide substantial information about quality of learning? And that means also quality of our teaching. We cannot reduce human behaviors to performance and potential algorithmic analysis. Human behavior is complex, education is complex. So just reducing lives to a number, it's not really a good idea. And we need to think about how outsourced platforms in the context of education are using our data. And for example, ebook providers. Every day is a new one. If they're analyzing facial expression, if they're collecting biodata, clicks, what are they doing? What are they doing with the camera in the ebook reader? What are they doing with the camera or the microphone in a computer? Because we're buying a product from them, we're buying a book, but actually they're extracting data from our students, and we haven't paid for that service. So we need to keep an eye on who are we procuring from in the case of like technologies in the sense of education. And this is a great work the alt community is doing about ethics of edtech. So totally recommend to have a look at the framework and contact the alt community, so Association of Learning Technologies in the UK, and have a look at the again, and just to start closing down, predictive modeling in learning analytics can lead to discrimination. We cannot predict the future. Machines cannot predict the future. This is basically the same as tarot hand reading. We cannot predict the future. We don't know what's going to happen. So we can try to understand what can happen, but we cannot predict or assert for sure what is going to happen with a person in the future. And we need to prevent that algorithmic surveillance becomes a substitution for human engagement and judgment. And I don't know if you heard about like the ChatGPT case in, I think it was Colombia not long ago, where a judge basically sentenced someone through ChatGPT. It's like someone could have ended up in jail just because ChatGPT said so. ChatGPT is racist and is sexist, and it's a machine. So we cannot have machines judging people, because this is unfair and should be rather illegal. So we need to foster spaces for better human engagement, better human communication, and designing complex pedagogies around the students, making them the center of the education system rather than the machines. And I think we cannot, and this is quite interesting, we cannot keep rewarding those with good data and leaving them alone, or punishing those with bad data, because basically we're using a Skinner model of basic rewards and punishments. So it's 21st century technology and 19th century systems in interactions with humans. So it's just an open door for us to think about what we're doing, the sticks and carrots as well. So what we're doing with the data, who are we punishing, who are we rewarding through bad or good interaction with a machine. So for the IT sector, and I think this is something that we're doing quite nicely at the University of Suffolk, we need to make sure that we are aware how data is being collected, how to use data fairly, who is analyzing our data. And this is something that I'm very proud of this institution. We are very careful with our data. We need to think about how we constrain bias and the potential effects, and having data governance committees or talk to others about data. And this is just good practices. It's just simple things that we could be doing as IT sector. And create an environment for fair and ethical learning analytics policy. So right to privacy, giving people agency, creating an agency and through data literacy, generating spaces for human interaction and positive interventions, being transparent about the mechanisms, the statistical modeling, and the algorithms that we're using, and ensure that data protection and student-centered practices are at the heart of whatever we do with our data. So I think I'm closing down here. The right of privacy, it's important, and it's a human right. And we need to be thinking about how we're going to protect our learners and ourselves from future potential risky data interventions. So thanks so much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Javiera. That was a really powerful presentation, if not a little bit disconcerting and worrying in parts. Fascinating, and really, really appreciate you taking the time to share your work and your research and your analysis with us. There's a few questions coming in as well as some comments. So thank you, Rina, for your comments and question around a very thorough presentation. And Rina's question is, how can a student control or have a say that their data is not part of learning analytics in higher education? So Rina suggests that learning analytics are now sewn so strongly into the fabric of institutions. So how can they have perhaps more agency, more of a say in how that data is used?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself and I just messed around. It's about transparent governance. Students need to be aware, and there needs to be conversations, for example, with the student union and specific groups, so they know what is going on. Because most of the learning analytics happen in the background, where nobody can see these interactions. If it's just a transparent and open conversation and say, okay, we need to use your data to do X, Y, and Z, and we can show you the process, and there is spaces where they can just have a look on what the university is doing, that creates a sense of dialogue, that creates a sense of also of ownership of the work that we do around with data. Because of course it's now soon into the fabric of an institution, but also we need to rethink our own practices, and it's about that data governance and having the transparency models around the data and having open conversations.
Thank you, and thank you for your question, Rina. There's so many comments coming in, Javier. I'm struggling to keep up. I finally feel like a radio show host. So fascinating. Thank you. A very powerful presentation. Thank you, Ada. Justin Brett has asked, in all of what you have said, Javiera, is there any space for optimism?
Yeah, I think there is. I think there is. And there is also comes from the work that the civil society is doing about auditing algorithms and the work that lots of academics are doing around creating fair data cultures in higher education and working with our colleagues and our students in creating first something around data literacy to be more explicit on how we use data, and also into thinking that in the future people will have the literacies needed to participate in society, because understanding data is something that allows you to participate in democracies nowadays. And I think all the work that colleagues, for example, in the Data Justice Lab in Cardiff, in the data school, the work that we're doing here as well, people with the colleagues from UCL and the work that the Digital Futures group is bringing in, we'll start creating the understanding of the impact of data and how people can have negotiation and human conversations and reflections around data. Data, when I was studying library science, data was something like called gray information, obscure information. Now it's open, it's there, everyone can access it. Now it needs to be like basically a trigger for opening up conversations. But if we deploy and develop data literacies, we can have more honest conversations. I think the work here is to increase the amount of people that is literate around data and using the data to trigger conversations that are interesting and to support the students rather than creating punitive or rewarding mechanisms only. So yeah, I have a hope, I have a future, hope in the future with data.
Thank you. And thank you for your question. Thank you, Tarek, for your comment and for being here this afternoon. And thank you also to Pallavi. So Pallavi has suggested, thank you for this thought-provoking and rather topical presentation of your research around objectification and surveillance of childhood and education. And we know that this is translating to higher education. My question is, how do we ensure data literacy and the right to privacy when we are continuously watching, punishing, and rewarding? Thank you for your question, Pallavi.
Okay, around data literacy, and those that don't mean in the case of Pallavi, know that I'm doing quite a lot of research about, for example, changing the way that we work with data in research environments and how we work with our communities, how we work with people instead of like using people to inform our research. The dynamics and the power structures with data needs to change. And there is quite a lot of work that I'm really happy to be doing through the PGCAP, and there are all the colleagues are doing on all the institutions around creating data literacies in academics so then they can transfer all this knowledge to students. Because the work around data is quite new. If we think about, we were talking about the information society until not long ago. The change of the discourse, the change of the dynamics is start changing. And it's also our responsibility as educators to start raising and finding spaces to build up our own data literacy. We don't have to become data scientists, but we need to understand how the machine operates and kind of the politics behind data. And also we need to think on our practices and find the spaces in the university where we can talk openly about what we're doing with our data, what we're doing with students' data, and how we can improve our provision rather than just using it to automate decisions or make decisions around students. But this idea, for example, of the frameworks that Advanced HE provides for co-creation students as partners is a great space for bringing the students and the educators' voices together when we foster spaces for curriculum design, for policymaking, for questioning practices. We need to have more open spaces. This is the only way forward when working with data.
Thank you, and thank you for your question, Pallavi. Thank you for your comment, Manos. So Manos has suggested very informative and powerful presentation. Javiera, thank you. Please do keep those questions coming in. We have until 5 o'clock, so we've got a few more minutes. Thank you to David James for your question. David suggests really interesting. I was wondering if the data itself is actually a moral agent that has its own agency rather than just data. And I guess that speaks to that idea that data is not neutral, Javiera?
No, data is not neutral. Data is a political instrument. The idea of, the neutrality of data, not true. And it is a moral agent, and is the stick, not always carrot. So when we think about how the voice of data and the voice of that they handle data are the voice of wisdom these days, because nobody can question them, because nobody can understand the data. It's an issue itself. That's why this gap between the data literate and the data illiterate, so the power dynamic, is widening and widening. We need to think who is providing the data, how that data was collected, and how the people in that data are portrayed. So again, inadequate. This is actually a moral tag. These people is inadequate. And we're using language that is complicated, and language that will have an effect, and we will start questioning this language in the next 20 years. How people is labeled, and why, who has the moral authority to tell me that this group is inadequate? Yeah, there is a moral issue in there, and part of our work is to question it.
Thank you, and that's a really interesting question, and that concept is perhaps something that is going to be explored and unpacked in the next few years. Justin, in response to the call for optimism, said that it was reassuring. So thank you, Javiera. And Pallavi always also suggests her thanks for, and looks forward to seeing this application of your work across the university. Just while maybe a few more questions are coming in, if I could just speak about a few things that I found quite interesting, and maybe if you allow me an anecdote in terms of thinking about this idea of engagement through clicks, and this idea that clicks are almost a substitute for human engagement. So we've almost arrived at a time where we see good students as those who have completed all of their Brightspace or online portal activities and gone through all of the content because it's perhaps more visible and more measurable. But maybe the student who goes to the library and takes out a book is perhaps seen, because we don't necessarily know, or that those activities aren't as visible or as measurable, do we still see those activities as valuable? Because that's perhaps better engagement than a student who has almost played the system and completed, engaged through clicks, as you have sort of coined the term. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and this happens, for example, with mature students. Most of mature students spend more time offline learning than online learning. They tend to download the resources and read them offline. And then they're the ones that like trigger the flag. It's like, oh, they are not engaged. Actually, they're quite engaged. They're doing at their own time on their own pace. So we need to keep an eye on what we mean by engagement, and how we mean by how people is interacting with platforms. Coming back to David's comment here in the chat, inequalities, data uses for policing. Couple of books that you might like to read. One is Automation Inequality. It talks about a lot of crime and how crime is measured and predicted through data. Of course, Weapons of Mass Destruction, and also Shoshana, I can never pronounce her name, Zuboff's book about surveillance capitalism. Because what we see here in education is just the tip of an iceberg. In terms of, for example, crime and prediction of crime, it's actually way harder than we can ever imagine. So yeah, the policing through data and the moral issues around data and vulnerable communities. It's actually quite strong when we think about incarceration rates are much higher for people that are already targeted through data. Policing, it's in kind of policing through camera and data collection is way higher in deprived backgrounds because it's kind of predicted that in this place they're going to commit more crimes. So we're going to put more tools that are actually going to check those crimes. But actually, when you see how much crime is committed in exclusive neighborhoods, because it's basically economic crime. So yeah, fraud and financial fraud. This is not monitored, not police. So yeah, if you want to work around with your students about crime and data, I'm happy to send you some books and chapters for you to have a look, David.
Okay, thank you, Javiera. And Justin, who's probably got the last comment of the day in terms of predictive data works on a macro level, but not necessarily for individuals. So thank you to everyone for your comments and questions. I feel like this session has been extremely thought-provoking and fascinating. So huge thanks to Javiera for sharing your insights and research with us. I think there's lots to take away from this. Before ending this session and signing off, I'd like to signpost you to our next Learning and Teaching webinar series session, which will be delivered by Dr. Christian Dogaru, and that will be on the 10th of May. Now, Christian will be focusing on adapting to block teaching, assessment and engagement. So it should follow on quite nicely from Javiera's session. It would be great if you could join us. Please do follow our socials for information about these sessions. You can sign up in the link in the chat. I wish you a lovely evening, and once again, thank you for joining us. Goodbye.
Bye.